Ladies, gentlemen, and hurrah of all ages, with the mid-season patch soon approaching for Diablo 4 Season 6, we are of course expecting, or at least hoping, for some level of change to the current balance between the classes. Things have been pretty out of whack since the expansion release, at least from a general view, but one of the most telling things in my opinion is always to look at the highest pit tier clears from each class, especially at this point. Of course, pit runs aren't necessarily a representation of the entire rest of the game. Some builds function much better in the pit than they do outside of the pit, and the same goes for classes. But the longer we run out the same sort of balance patch, the more time there is for less popular classes to catch up. The more popular a class is, the higher chance that there is one player out there that will just have perfect 4 out of 4 greater affix gear in every slot because there are just more people playing. The less people play in a class, the longer that takes to happen. That said, with the mid-season patch fast approaching and with it now being long enough from season start that even the less popular classes are starting to hit their proper limits, I thought this would be a pretty good time to go over one final set of power rankings around how everything is looking right now before any major potential shifts happen in this mid-season patch. I'll be talking around the highest pit tier for each class, but also mentioning any other builds for them that come close too, and then we can use that to sort of just analyze the current balancing of the game as a whole. Starting off then with the lowest pit tier clear, this is still unfortunately Druid. However, the actual number has been brought up to tier 108, and this is pretty solid. It's actually been accomplished by 2 separate Druid builds now too, just with time differences of completion. The technical best one by this metric then is actually Boulder Druid, which is awesome to see personally. I have always loved the concept of Boulder Druid and having it function as a core skill through the legendary aspect, and this was made truly fun, at least as a playstyle, when they added in the Dolmen Stone to make boulders fling around you and orbit you while you walk through enemies with Hurricane active. I think it's an awesome playstyle, which just has had a bunch of different issues for months and months, and after being patched probably more than like 10 different times, it is finally in a place where it can at least compete to be called Druid's strongest build, and I do love to see it here, and clearly the devs wanted it to be there too. The other Druid build that has also completed a tier 108 pit is Hurricane. We did talk about this in our previous power rankings as it was the top build for Druid before, and while these builds have pretty vastly different playstyles in general, there are still a few core things that they share under the hood, like using Poison Creeper purely to make enemies count as being poisoned, and then using what are essentially overpower snapshots. The difference being Hurricane uses one overpower snapshot for the entire Hurricane duration, whereas Boulder tries to snapshot pretty much every boulder so that it will overpower for the whole duration too. Overall, tier 108 pits doesn't feel like the worst place to cap out as a class, and having multiple builds that can reach it is a solid statement for the class in itself. Even if it compares worse to the other classes, it still has at least a bit of balance within itself. Obviously there are kinks to be worked past, but it's clearly much tighter now than it has been in the past for Druid. Next up then, with a pit tier 113 as its highest completion, is Rogue, specifically with another variation of an imbuement heavy rapid fire build. This one is less about snapshotting than it is just about maximizing every buff possible into your rapid fire casts. The probably most disgusting thing in this combo though that enables the usage is the Cax-Yax runeword combo. Cax giving offering whenever you drink a potion, Yax forcing your next skill after activating to use all of your primary resource to do up to double damage. So basically you build full resource, you drink 2 potions, you hit rapid fire for big damage. Of course that is simplifying it down a load. It's really awkward to force 2 potion drinks before every rapid fire cast, but I wanted to get across just how uncomfortable this is to play as a build concept. Yes, it results in strength when you use it properly, and a tier 113 pit is a solid place to end up, but it's still above where the devs seemingly intended builds to cap out in power, and the fact that it's achieved through just mass chugging potions at the right time in your damage rotation feels just sort of gross, honestly. The build itself is great, the pit completion is an achievement for sure, don't get me wrong, but I think even Rogue players would agree with me that they'd all be better off if this interaction wasn't a thing, and instead they just buffed the power of Rogue in a different way. It isn't a bug necessarily, but it definitely doesn't feel like intentional game design resulted in this, and it's definitely not comfortable to play around. However, regardless, this build makes Rogue able to complete a tier 113, which is an admirable stopping point. Moving up to 4th place then, we have Barbarian with a tier 118 pit completion now, and this is a pretty identical build to the last time that we talked about this. It's Mighty Throw based around some really hefty snapshotting bugs. Specifically, once you throw Mighty Throw down, the pulses that come out around it on the floor create a snapshot effect where if you cast Mighty Throw again before the pulses stop, all the new pulses will have the exact same buffs as the original pulses from the cast. You can use this on Barbarian especially to stack a ton of damage bonuses, from things like a damage boost from overpowering with Hammer of the Ancients, casting Call of the Ancients for all of the boosts from having your ult active, and then getting guaranteed overpower from Bash as well, and then using all of that on a singular Mighty Throw, and then as long as you keep casting them back to back to back, they'll keep all of those damage boosts active permanently. This creates a very odd looking gameplay loop where you slowly group up big packs of enemies, slowly build up all your buffs, and then the moment you just start spamming Mighty Throw, everything just starts to sort of fall over. It's really funky. Again, it definitely feels unintentional intended, and it doesn't really make sense to use it this way outside of the pit either, so we'll have to see how this looks after the patch, either mid-season or even next season. But as of the last check-in before mid-season right now, this is pretty thoroughly capped out at around tier 118, as it's been sitting in this range for over a week now with very slight changes and variation. That said, in third place is actually a bit of a surprise. With a tier 120 pit completion, we have Bone Spirit Necromancer. This is another one that has been locked a bit in position for over a week. It's things around it that has shifted. Necromancer is a generally popular class, and also the formula for power in this class is pretty much about as solid as it can be at the moment. Build tons of resource generation, build a bunch of maximum resource, get guaranteed overpowers and crits, and then Bone Spirit, with enough cooldown reduction combined with Bone Spirit itself being a critical hit, and the way its enhancements work means that it removes its own cooldown, essentially allowing you to spam it on repeat. Combine in Soul Rift, the new ultimate, which has a bunch of interactions with both generating essence and spending it, and you get an extremely powerful build that has been modified with the new skill added in the expansion, and is able to reach the now third highest peak of any class in the game when it comes to pit clearing at the very least. This becomes far less comfortable to use as a build in most other content that isn't pit, but pit tiers are really the best way to judge the top end power for each class, which is what this is all about. This is also a very relevant statement though for our number 2 class today, which is Sorcerer, which has now completed a full-on tier 121 pit, now second among all classes, with something a bit different from what we were seeing before in the top end for the class. Up until now, most of the top runs have been pretty pure fireball builds. They started to work in Shatter, of course, because of a double dipping bug between Greater Fireball and Shatter, and this just became more and more prevalent the higher health that enemies had. Greater Fireball makes fireball casts apply a percent of burning damage as direct damage, and Shatter makes frozen enemies explode when the freeze ends for a portion of the damage dealt to them. This includes both the base burning and the bonus from Greater Fireball, all lumped together really nicely. This, however, was capping out at around pit tier 110, until a new way of using this bugged interaction was thought up, which is Firebolt and Firewall. It's essentially a very similar build to one that was near the top last season, and the main reason this hadn't come up beforehand is because it was theoretically nerfed going into the season, but there's some sort of bug going on between Fireball and Shatter that makes it, again, just really strong even in Season 6, even after Shatter was theoretically nerfed a fair bit. The thing with Greater Fireball is it applies a portion of all burning damage as direct damage, not just burns from Fireball itself, so technically the best way to make use of that is to apply as much burning damage as possible, and then just use Fireball as a sort of bonus pop to make your Shatters do more damage, to make it do a bigger burst. So this build's whole concept is using the old Firebolt and Firewall combo that increases projectiles a ton and works off of basic skill damage, which is super boostable, and then using Shatter and Greater Fireball to cause massive pops of damage, which scale far better off of the Firebolt's build than they do off of a pure Fireball setup, due to just all of the extra burning damage. It should be noted as well that this build is pretty much only for pit pushing. It's pretty trash everywhere else because it fully relies on Shatter for the damage. Even the boss at the end has to be the specific boss that summons a bunch of adds if you want to complete a high pit tier. But when it comes to judging the power of each class past a certain point, the only method we really have in the game is pit tiers, so a pit pushing build will be here. That said, I want to emphasize that in every other part of the game, Sorcerer still needs serious help. Shatter builds are only good for pit pushing, where enemies have loads of health. It may be the second best at the top end of power, but it's only second best because of how this specific interaction works with this activity. Just because it's the second best pit class doesn't mean that it doesn't need buffs to other parts of the class for future seasons. Then we come to first place, and you all probably know it was going to be here anyways. It's Spiritborn, specifically Quill Volley builds, with the new highest record being a just barely below 2-minute tier 150 completion. Yup, we're under 2 minutes now, but the technically best legit run is around 2 minutes and 18 seconds. This is a thing that I now have to specify because there is an exploit that was around before that allowed masterworking with Spiritborn to do really funky stuff, and some of the top runs are sort of taking advantage of this. I'll let people get some pieces of gear that simply give you more stats than you're allowed to, in this case, more maximum resolve stacks, which allows you to mess with your gear in some very advantageous ways, and it is a clear exploit. You're not supposed to be able to get that many stacks, but some people did. As disappointing as it is to see this being used in the top pit runs, the majority of the top pit runs for Spiritborn are now abusing this currently. You can tell by the number of resolve stacks on their actual buff bar if you count them, and this includes the current top clear. It is essentially a race between people that are abusing the same exploit, so it's sort of funky, but the best clear that does not use this seems to be 2 minutes and 18 seconds. All that said, there is a question of how much we should even weigh that exploit as a thing. It obviously feels very unclean, but even outside of this, Spiritborn as a class is absolutely busted. How much does any of this really matter? There is no denying the just sheer number of strong bugs that make it even better, but for reference of just how strong the bugs are, it isn't even just for one build either. Crushing Hand has completed a tier 150, even Touch of Death has now completed a tier 150 by working out the best set of these bugs to put together around it. To try and sort of condense it down, there's just an insane amount of double dipping effects going on with the class. Viscous Shield is the best known bug because it increases damage by like hundreds if not thousands of percent depending on how much bonus maximum life you have too, but that actually has less of an effect than you may think compared to just the combination of everything else stacking on top of each other. What this does is make multipliers multiply each other. Rather than just having one large multiplier in Viscous Shield, the amount of double dipping makes the multipliers apply multiple times. The biggest culprit for this is Jaguar Primary Spirit Hull, which echoes a portion of the damage that you've dealt in the last half of a second every 15 hits. Your initial damage is boosted by the Viscous Shield bug, then anytime the Jaguar Spirit Hull damage triggers as well, its calculation is based off of the damage that you've already done, so it includes Viscous Shield, but then it gets boosted when it's applied a second time by the Viscous Shield bug again. This further double dips with things like the Ring of Starless Skies, so you get 50% boost on the base damage and then 50% boost on the primary Jaguar Spirit Hull hit afterwards. It double dips with Mystic Circles and Plains Power as well, so you get bonus damage on the initial hits, which then applies a second time to the Jaguar Spirit Hull hit, and then it also stacks with the Fell Soothsayer aspect, which makes enemies explode for a portion of the lethal hit that would have killed them. The lethal hit itself will have had all of those initial damage boosts, but then the pop of damage from the aspect also gets those boosts a second time. It double dips, and God forbid if you can loop Fell Soothsayer damage into the Jaguar Spirit Hull pops, as these can cause a feedback loop within itself that hits literally quadrillions of damage on larger groups of enemies. To put it simply, there is just a lot of bugs going on in this class, a lot of interactions intermingling that shouldn't, and it's sort of like Mr. Burns having so many different illnesses that he almost seems healthy. That just about does it for today then, everyone. The power rankings now that the dust is sort of settled, leading into the upcoming mid-season patch for Diablo 4's 6th season. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and of course let me know your thoughts on any of this down in the comments below too. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.